I'm sitting in Charles Ives's reconstructed studio at the American Academy, and I'm looking over right now a collection of typed up reviews of Ives's music that Ives had typed up. One of the myths that was around for Ives for a long time was that he didn't care about what happened to his music. He didn't really care about what people thought of it. It's not true at all. He had scrapbooks of reviews like this one of his music. He kept careful scrapbooks of reviews and articles about every composer imaginable at the time. He was tracking, in effect, the competition. I first ran into Ives when I was about 14 or 15 through a record album cover that's sitting out there at the American Academy right now as an exhibition of Bernstein's recording of the Second Symphony, and it was in an ad for the Columbia Record Club in a magazine. And I just looked at that record cover, and I'd never heard of Ives before. I said, I like that face, I like that name. I bet I'll like that music. So I did what a teenager does. I just went to a record store and picked up the first recording I found, which was the old Howard Hanson recording of Three Places in New England, and took it home and listened to it and was, of course, astounded and confused and perplexed. So I just kept listening to it. And I started reading about Ives, and he became a great hero to me, my first great music hero, because I was a nerdy kid in Chattanooga, Tennessee, whose interest in classical music was pretty strange to start with. And I just felt that his independence was something that appealed to me terrifically. But I gradually, of course, learned more and more. I wrote my undergraduate thesis in college on Ives's Fourth Symphony. And I'm a composer. So what I would like to do to contribute to this series of interviews is to sort of tour Ives's life in a very direct, practical way, looking at it as a composer rather than, say, a performer or a theorist, and maybe get rid of a few myths on the way, lingering myths. Because one of the things about Ives was that he was so much on his own tack that when he first began to come before the public, people really didn't know what to make of him, because there was nothing to quite relate him to except what people knew of modernism at the time, which was, so when he was first heard, he would be compared to Stravinsky and Schoenberg and so forth, as if he was part of that tradition. Well, he really wasn't. He was in his own tradition. It's often been said, and I agree with it, that the best description of Ives and his music is Ivesian. He was a singular character in the same way that the best description of Kafka is Kafkaesque. So how does somebody like him happen, and why? I want to see if I can get a sort of general sense of that and how it developed in a kind of immediate way. So the first thing that happens is he's born the son of a musician, a town musician, in Danbury, Connecticut, which was a town that was very musical, but music was fun and games. It was not taken very seriously. And his father was a very dedicated musician. He had been a band director in the Civil War, said to have the best band in the Army, and I think he was a teenager at the time, George Ives. And he had a couple of kids, and his family was very business-oriented. But George was fascinated by music, and he went into music. He became the town band director. He was also a church choir director. He was mainly a trumpet player. He studied music in New York. In another situation in a bigger city with different opportunities, he might have been a serious big city musician, but he stayed in town. He stayed with the family. And the Ives were a big deal in Danbury, starting with the grandparents of Charlie. So he had a kid. Now, the first thing about having a son, he had two sons, is there's a kind of idea around these days that there's really no such thing as talent. There's just application and how much you love what you're doing and you put in your 10,000 hours. No, the talent is a very real thing. Charles Ives was a born huge musical talent, which is something his father would have realized quite early. Now, the story is that Ives told was that his father came in one day and 4-year-old Charlie was banging out Ives' band's drum parts on the piano with his fists. And George, this is very typical George, instead of saying, Charlie, that's not how to play the piano, because kids often play piano with their fists, he said, okay, that's fine. Let's teach you something about drums. So he sent him down to the local barber, gave him drum lessons. And George had this tremendously inquiring mind. And I think one of the reasons for that is that he had a book in his library by Helmholtz. He was the first great writer and theorist about musical acoustics. And one of the things that Helmholtz says in this book, Helmholtz met Brahms, by the way. I wrote a book about Brahms, and they talked to each other, and they had nothing to say to each other because they spoke two completely different languages. Brahms was talking about polyphony and counterpoint and form, and Helmholtz was talking about overtones and acoustics. One of the things that Helmholtz says in that book that I think had a huge impact on George and therefore on his son was that the system of harmony that we use is not natural as we think it is. It's a construct and it will change. It doesn't have anything to do necessarily strongly with inevitably with the nature of acoustics. So George became fascinated with acoustics, and one of Charlie's earliest memories was his father standing outside in a storm, in the rain, listening to the church bell next door, and coming in, George had perfect pitch, and trying to get the sound of the bell on the piano with all the correct overtones, as he would have known from Helmholtz. And he found he couldn't do it because some of the notes he needed to do it were between the keys of the piano. So that's when he got interested in those notes between the keys of the piano, which we call quarter tones. And the other thing about George was that he had been a Civil War band director. And what that meant was you were totally involved in war. Often the band after the battle would be on the details to bury the dead. Sometimes you marched into battle and started a battle with a band playing behind you. And meanwhile, George and the band would be playing serenades at night sometime, and they'd be playing these marches to march with. From battle to battle, they would be playing sentimental songs like Tenting in the Old Campground, which sound very corny to us, but these were sung by soldiers who were tenting in the old campground before battle sometimes. And George came to feel that these simple folk songs, sentimental songs, were something profound to people deeply where they lived, in this case of soldiers. And so he absorbed this kind of view of music, again, this is George, as deeply expressive, no matter what it may be on the surface of some human realities beneath the surface. So, meanwhile, he had a son whom he would have realized very quickly had tremendous talent. So he began to educate Charlie in the direction of being a concert pianist, giving him lessons. And meanwhile, he was also playing organ. Well, Charlie had the capacity to be a concert pianist. He was that good, and he was a prodigy. But he didn't go in that direction because he was not really interested in sitting alone on a stage and being that kind of star. He became a church organist, and he was a prodigy at that as well. He was a church organist professional from the age of 14. And he eventually studied with two of the leading organists in the country, and he was probably one of the finest American organists of his generation. And by the way, his first big-time job was at Center Church in New Haven, replacing one of his teachers, who was one of the leading organists in the country, and Charlie was a freshman at Yale at the time. He was a very fine keyboard player. But meanwhile, his experience of music was had a lot to do with his father's band. He played in his father's band, I'm pretty sure. He may have played drums, may have played trumpet. And bands are a very particular kind of musical culture, let's put it that way. It's very sociable, and it's it's amateurs who are playing for love rather than money, and they're playing for their neighbors and their friends. They play concerts, they play parades, they play George had a group that would play in trains and boats, And these were part of social situations. And meanwhile, the repertoire of bands was all over the place. It was popular tunes, it was marches, it was hymns, it was excerpts from classical pieces. Meanwhile, in Charlie's organ studies, he played the classical repertoire. He played one of his big showpieces was William Tell Overture on organ, which he learned in his early teens and played in concerts for probably the rest of his career. He would play movements of Brahms on the organ. So his musical education was this kind of grab bag thing that came from bands partially, that was involved in the music that you heard in a small town, theater music. He would have become aware as soon as the ragtime 1890s. He became very aware of ragtime when it came in as a fantastic popular music. And what I'm getting at is that his education, even though at first it was geared very much to being a concert pianist and playing the classical repertoire. Meanwhile, he had the influence of his father, who said, "Charlie, music is something interior. It's something that is meaningful to you in your spirit." So you imagine all these influences working on the sensibility of a tremendously talented, imaginative kid. And meanwhile, it's as if there's a divide in his life. There's the keyboard practice, and there is the wild grab bag of music that he was hearing in town and in church. And he was going to camp meetings where he heard 1,000 people singing hymns. And he was the first person maybe to realize that when a lot of people sing a hymn, some people are above the pitch and some people are below the pitch. And so what you're actually hearing is a moving tone cluster. Well, everybody had heard that from time immemorial, but he really homed in on that and said that is as much the music as the notes. That's what his father taught him. And his father did another thing once where he had the elements of the band spread around town square playing a piece with variations on that same piece being played by different contingents at the same time. And George would take his cornet and play it for Charlie close up and then further away and then further away and then across a pond. This again comes from Helmholtz. So that Charlie could understand the effect on the timbre of distance, of space. And George would march two bands around the town green playing different pieces to see acoustically what happened as they passed and came closer and then passed. And he was interested in the kind of acoustic effect of that, but it was also a game saying you've got to hold your own, you've got to stay, each of you has to keep your own tune and your own tempo. And Charlie took that in. His father had a slide trumpet made because he said when the congregation gets out of tune, that's what they're doing. It's my duty to follow them. So he had a slide trumpet made so he could follow the changing tuning of his choirs. And all these things acting on Charlie's sensibility. Another thing George did was to have his kids, he probably trained Charlie's brother Moss in some of these things too. I don't know if Moss played anything. But he would have the kids sing a tune in one key, like London Bridge is Falling Down, while George accompanied in a different key, which we call polytonality. And the game was you just had to get through to the end and hold your own. And Ives, by the way, wrote a piece called Holding Your Own later. Moss really wasn't interested in music. He eventually became a judge, but the brothers were very close. So Ives was divided between the classical repertoire he was learning as a pianist and later as an organist, and studying very strictly, and eventually with very serious teachers, and the town music he heard around him, but also the life of a boy. And he was very divided about that. He said later that when he wanted to be out playing baseball, he was very interested in sports. It felt all wrong, he said, to have to stay in and practice piano. And he was expected to practice. It was enforced to a degree. So there were all these divisions in him, and there was also the division that music was not taken seriously. And in a little town like Danbury, except as an entertainment. But though it was everywhere all the time, you went to the theater, you went to the ball game, we traveled on a train, you went on the boat, there was music everywhere. And of course, they didn't have record players in those days, so it had to be live music, and that was also very important. You were playing as an amateur out of love for your friends and your family who were close up and listening to you. So Ives grew up in that milieu that was so different from the milieu of somebody who grows up in a big city and maybe goes to a fancy teacher and then goes to a conservatory and so forth. The other thing about Ives was that his professional experience was as a church musician, which is a very particular thing. It's different than being a straight classical musician. His tradition was not the tradition of orchestras and conservatories. It was the tradition of church music, in which you might play Bach and Brahms at church, but you were also playing hymns, and it's just a completely different situation. So when Charlie started writing music, he wrote pieces for his father's band. He wrote little practical things. He wrote songs that you would sing in the parlor, conventional things, but he also wrote experiments, and his father encouraged his experiments, though not necessarily encouraged making them public. For example, when Charlie was about 17, he wrote Variations on America, a patriotic tune for organ, which was a showpiece for him because it has a fabulous, incredibly hard pedal part, among other things. It had some polytonal interludes because Charlie was already experimenting. Since his father had this idea of making them sing in one key while accompanying another, he started experimenting with things in two keys. And he had some interludes in his Variations on America in two keys, and Daddy said, Charlie, you shouldn't play those when you play it in church. Let's leave those out. It'll make the boys laugh. So George, on the other hand, utterly open. And on the other hand, let's not get too wild in public yet. But George also said something incredible to Charlie. He said, any chord you want to write, any chord is acceptable if you know what you're doing with it. I don't think any composer had ever been told that before in the history of the world. He was the first. And he knew what to do with it. So he was doing experiments, and he was writing more conventional pieces like the Variations on America and marches for the Father's Band. By the way, Charlie Ives wrote some very good marches. He was maybe not Sousa, but he was close. Like the Circus Band, which is a terrific tune. He wrote these kind of surreal words to it later. And he had this divide between the experimental side, which came from his father. His father was sort of a Yankee tinker in music, let's put it that way. And he had his conventional side, because George also taught him straight harmony, and right out of a book, the Addison, standard book of harmony. So Charlie knew all that stuff. And then it was a family tradition that to go to Yale. And Charlie was not that much of a student. He wasn't that interested in studies. He had a great intellectual curiosity. He was a reader, but he was not really that good in school. He was busy. He was practicing. He was performing. He was a church organist, a professional. He was playing on the baseball team. He was a pitcher. Sometimes when the ladies asked him what he played, his answer was shortstop. And meanwhile, though, he was supposed to go to Yale. So they sent him to New Haven to a preparatory school, Hopkins, where he played on the baseball team. And I think basically Hopkins, with him on the mound, if I'm right about this, beat the Yale freshman, which was a big deal at Hopkins at that time. So he's getting ready to go to Yale. Well, as it happened, I don't think this is not why he was sent. He was not sent to Yale to study music. Though it was probably understood that he maybe take some lessons or something. And by this point, he was an extremely good organist, a pro. It happened that Yale was creating was it the first or the second, I'm not quite sure, music department in the country, and they hired a guy named Horatio Parker. And he formed a very ambitious music program, and I don't think they knew about that when they sent Charlie to get ready for Yale. And Parker was quite possibly the best, most sophisticated teacher of composition in the country at that time. So by the way, we're getting into some old myths about Ives, that he was some kind of primitive, that he was, as Leonard Bernstein very regrettably, and he should have known better, said at some point, Ives was the grandma Moses of music, meaning a primitive. He was not. He was a very high-level professional organist and church musician. He studied with the best organist in the country, and he studied with the best composition teacher in the country at Yale, who had a very ambitious program of theory and history. And meanwhile, Parker had been through the usual musical education for composers of the time in America. There was a big question at that time that was just beginning to come to a head, which is, what is American music? American classical music was taking off. American orchestras were getting very sophisticated. They were building concert halls. Boston Symphony Hall was built, I believe, in 1890, when it was around a few years after the Boston Symphony was formed, with a protege of Brahms as conductor. And people were beginning to say, what is American music? And Antonin Dvorak was brought to America to teach Americans how to write nationalistic music. That was his job, and he took it seriously, and that's why he wrote the American String Quartet and the New World Symphony. And Dvorak said, well, now, Dvorak came out of a very unified culture of Bohemian music, which was a real thing. The problem with trying to say what is an American music is, what is America? It's a grab bag country. It's a country of immigrants. What was going to be Ives' solution eventually was to say the local is what you do if you're an American, because there is no other option in a way. But what Dvorak said is, why don't you listen to the melodies of Native Americans, of Indians, and Black Americans, and maybe form a music based on that. And Dvorak in the New World Symphony, he wrote a slow movement that was a kind of imitation of a spiritual, which was Black music of the time. There was a lot of racist outcry about that. There were also people who took him very literally and started writing, sort of Negro tunes for orchestra, and others started going to study Indian music, and these proper guys who grew up in Boston and were writing imitation Native American things, hi-ya-ya-ya-hi-ya, and that kind of thing. And it was kind of pathetic, but it was an honest attempt to say, what is American music? And Ives, meanwhile, when he got a job at Center Church as organist as a freshman, which was a big deal, the choir director there, who was Ives was very close to, and was very encouraging to Ives, happened to have written his thesis for Heidelberg University in Germany on the search for an American music, and concluded in it that it was, for the time being, not really very imaginable to do that. So how did you learn to be a composer in America? You went to Germany, and you studied in a German conservatory. And as George Chadwick said, who was a Boston composer, they kept me harmonizing Bach chorales for 4 years, and I'm forever grateful for the discipline. So Horatio Parker, the founder of the Yale Music Department and Ives' teacher, had gone through that process of going to Germany and learning very proper traditional harmony, counterpoint, and form, and so forth and so on. And that was his point of view. His most famous piece was called Ora Novissima. It is the most extravagant, Victorian, proper, extremely craftsmanly, Germanic music you can possibly imagine. And that was what, in other words, the idea was that American classical composers had to create themselves in the model of European music, specifically German music. That was Parker's point of view. So Charlie, apparently at their first lesson, walked in and presented his new teacher with a fugue and 4 keys. The keys were simultaneous. The first voice started off in one key, the second voice came in a new key, as it was traditional, but the first voice kept going in the original key until he had stacked up 4 keys. And Parker said, don't bring in anything like this anymore. So he immediately squelched any original Ives ideas, and Ives settled down and said, okay, I got to do my homework. And he discovered that Parker was using the exact same harmony book that his father had already taught him. So he started over again, having known all this stuff, and started writing proper exercises and doing what Parker said. I believe he made B's in music. I think his average in everything else was D, if I remember. Charlie's friends said they were kind of amazed when he actually graduated. Parker is said to have said years later that Ives was the most talented student he ever had. He had to have noticed somewhere that this guy was phenomenal in his basic gift and understanding, but he was not interested in anything remotely experimental. Ives's church director was a little more open about that. So when Charlie wrote some polytonal things as preludes in center church, he was allowed to do them. He got some funny looks, and he definitely didn't do that all the time. One of the things about Ives is the idea he was doing wild stuff in church all the time. He would have gotten fired if he'd done that. He would slip in something occasionally. Meanwhile, the other thing about Ives at Yale that was very interesting was this guy who was really kind of closed off in this tight world of studying music and getting out to play baseball when he could and not paying much attention to school and so forth. How did he deal with Yale? And the answer was he was a big man on campus, actually, partly because he was so funny and so energetic. His nickname, everybody at Yale had a nickname. His nickname was Dasher because he was always dashing from one thing to another. He could do anything on piano. Everybody knew that, whether they heard him in church or not, because he would play at parties. He would sit in for the local pianist in the orchestra pit at the theaters. He played ragtime, which was the new rage. And he would, at parties, he would do these hilarious imitations of football games and things like that. He would get people involved in these things. You know, you sing one tune when I cue you, and I'll be playing this, and you sing another tune. And he was putting these things together that people looked at, and they got a kick out of them because they were jokes. The reality is that Ives was, they were jokes for Ives too, but he was listening to it. And these are things that all of which went into his music eventually. But meanwhile, he went through Parker's program. He started off writing a symphony, and he said, Parker was looking at the first movement of the symphony. He said, man, you're changing keys a whole lot. And I said, yeah, I kind of really like to keep doing that. And Parker said, okay, but you have to promise to end in the same key you started in. Charlie wrote 2 movements of a symphony whose influences were Dvorak and Brahms and Tchaikovsky. That is the first 2 movements of his first symphony. It's a damn good piece for a kid. It really is. And Ives wrote his string quartet for Parker, which is a proper quartet on the whole with some really remarkable things in it, including rhythmically. He didn't tell Parker, because Parker wouldn't have liked it, that it's all based on hymn tunes. Parker thought hymn tunes were inferior music, and Charlie was very interested in hymn tunes and gospel tunes. That's the whole string quartet is based on them. But he didn't let Parker know about that. And, it passed, so it was okay. So then, meanwhile, the other thing that happened in this, he was going great guns at college. He had a very impressive job. He was a big man on campus. He had girlfriends. He had a social life. He was all over the place. He played on informal sports teams. He played football. And then one day he got a phone call and said, your father is dead. So he was thunderstruck. There'd been tension between them, which probably made it worse because he was playing a lot of football and things like that. And he never really got over it. But what happened, in effect, was that Griggs, the choir director of his church, became kind of a surrogate father. And Griggs was also the only one who was willing to countenance his experiments. As Griggs said to him once, maybe God can even enjoy a dissonance once in a while. So he had to cope with the death of his father, who was also his great inspiration. And the distance and coldness of Horatio Parker, his teacher, who was not a warm and fuzzy guy at all. And Griggs was kind of stepped in to fill that role. And Ives was very lucky in that. He was lucky in all kinds of things. He was lucky to get to Yale when he did. He was lucky in Griggs. And he was lucky really in a way with Parker, because what Parker did teach him, for all Ives's reluctance, was things that George couldn't have taught him, like shaping large-scale forms. That came from Parker. So Charlie, in a way, I guess because of the loss of his father, maybe plunged into parties and theaters and ragtime and social life even more. But meanwhile, he was composing. And he was composing proper things for Parker. To a degree, the experimental side was put aside, but he was still tinkering with things here and there. And by the way, some of the things he wrote that are relatively well-behaved are tremendous pieces. Again, the first symphony is extraordinary. For a 22-year-old kid, the first string quartet is the same. One of Parker's exercises was to have them set songs, that texts that famous composers had set. So Ives's text was Feldeinsamkeit, which had been set by Brahms, and he wrote a song on that is one of the greatest songs written by an American to this day, I think. And who was it? I think Chadwick, who was a friend of Parker, visited class one day and heard Ives's Feldeinsamkeit and said to Parker, "You couldn't write a better song than that." Something Ives remembered. So this was his college career, playing in church, social life. He had a good friend named Dave Twitchell, who was also very popular. Ives was in Wolf's Head, one of the sort of after Skull and Bones, the big club. I think Dave was in that too. And Dave had a sister named Harmony, and their father was a minister at a very important church in Hartford, and happened to be Mark Twain's best friend. So Harmony grew up with people like Mark Twain in the house. And Charlie met her, I think went out with her maybe once in college. Nothing much happened. He stayed close to Dave, and then he got out of college and he said, what am I going to do? Well, now I'm getting back to the practical side of things. George, when Charlie went to college, George had sort of gone against the family business model, and being a band director, he didn't make that good a living. His family had always made a much better living. When Charlie went to college, his other son, Moss, the younger brother, was going to be going to college. He basically got a job in a bank, George. And there's a picture of him in those years, and he does not look happy, but he was also getting very sick. That's why he died. He had diabetes. He died of, I believe, of a heart attack, but he probably was affected by diabetes. And George told Charlie at some point, look, don't try to make a living in music. And what he was really saying is don't try to do what I've tried to do. Because I think George was depressed by then. I don't know that for sure. I think so. He said, get a good job. You want to raise a family, get a good job. And do your music on the side. Which in effect is what Charlie did. Though it's not quite that simple, I think. So what I'm getting at is Charlie got out of college and said, what am I going to do? So he said, okay, I'll go to work in the insurance business. Good job. I can make some money, raise a family. And Ives happened to have the kind of phenomenal energy where he was able to carry on two lives at the same time of being a composer and working in the insurance industry. And it turns out he was a very, very good insurance man. And eventually, with a partner, ended up with the biggest insurance agency in the country, Ives and Myrick. And meanwhile, he kept composing and doing experiments on the side, and got a law degree. I believe he was making law classes, pitching occasionally for baseball games in the park, and writing, meanwhile, finishing the First Symphony, which was a relatively well-behaved piece. Began to write the Second Symphony. He lived with a bunch of bachelors. They were having a great time. They were bemused by Ives playing piano all the time and doing these imitations of his football games and writing this sometimes, very strange music. And he was coming up in the insurance business at the same time. But what was happening in his head, again, I talked about how he was divided. He was divided as a kid between kind of the music of bands and town music and the music of the classics that he was learning as a pianist and organist, and also the desire to be a regular kid and get outside and play baseball. And he said later, I went to college for sports as much as anything. So he was still divided, but the divide now is between writing large pieces in European forms like the First Symphony and the First String Quartet, and writing small experimental pieces, for example, his series of psalms or choir chorus, which were all experiments in very particular technical ideas. He always thought technically. It's something else he got from his father. His father was partly thinking scientifically, which was the influence of Helmholtz. So Ives, for example, Psalm 67, which is an experiment in, it's sort of an experiment in polytonality, but it really isn't. It's an experiment in stacking up traditional chords one on top of the other. Other of his psalms are experiments in what we would call atonality or polytonality and so forth and so on. He began to write experimental pieces, which were all small because he didn't know yet how to put these experimental kinds of material. I'm using the word experimental. I don't really like the word, but we don't really have any other word for it because a lot of these were not really experiments. They were finished pieces, but they were particular technical studies. Schoenberg, by the way, was having the same issue in Europe and Webern. They were writing small pieces because they didn't yet know how to expand these kind of new ideas into large pieces. Ives was facing the same kind of questions that Schoenberg and Webern were in a different sphere. And an example of one of his experimental pieces is Over the Pavements. The other thing about Charlie was that everything he wrote, and this also came from his father, had a story behind it. And very often it was inspired by something you heard or saw. The effect of people singing in a big congregation or on a camp meeting where you're really hearing moving tone clusters. He wrote a wonderful chamber piece called Over the Pavements, which was inspired by the people walking past on the street outside, and everybody's walking at their own tempo. And it's one of his first great studies in polyrhythm. So we turned visual, observed human life into music, but he did it in technical terms. And that's one of the things that later confused people about him, because even a little sketch he did often would have a name on it, because and sometimes even if he wrote it, it didn't have anything to do particularly with observed life, he would still put a name on it because he wanted to write. He wrote program music. That's what he believed in. And when he started later his essays before a sonata, he starts off talking about how does music represent life. In other words, he's talking about program music. So the question was at this point, the two streams of his music, I don't particularly like it, but I'll call it the experimental and the traditional. The Second Symphony based on Stephen Foster tunes. He was, again, he had the influence of Griggs, who was really thinking about this issue, and the example of Dvorak, how to write an American music. So he wrote the Second Symphony, and the way of getting American about that was to base it on songs of Stephen Foster. And there's an Americana feel about the Second Symphony, even though it begins with a very dark, kind of romantic Germanic fugue, but then it goes into fiddle tunes and college songs and Stephen Foster, all kinds of bits of Americana. But the whole effect beyond this, the tunes, is there's a kind of straightforward freshness and frankness about the Second Symphony that anticipates what people like Aaron Copland would be writing 20 or 30 years later. And that symphony is a one-off, but it was an expanded piece, but it is a tonal piece that uses traditional harmony. The First Symphony is a tonal piece that uses traditional harmony. The First Symphony is very influenced by Dvorak. The Second Symphony less so, but it still has a very Dvorakian slow movement. And then something that happened that, again, changed his life. He met Harmony Twitchell again. And Harmony's father was preacher of a big church in Hartford. Her father was a liberal. This church, Asylum Hill, he was a follower of Bushnell. One of Bushnell's things was that he didn't believe in original sin. And Mark Twain, who was agnostic, actually attended the church. And he and Twitchell were great friends. Twitchell had been a chaplain in the Civil War, and his best friend was a Catholic priest. And Twitchell, when Asylum Hill was built, smuggled his friend, the Catholic, in for a little Catholic blessing for the church before it opened. So Twitchell was a very interesting guy, and his friends were people like Twain and novelists and artists of all kinds. Harmony was used to this. It's one of my lines about Harmony is she knew a genius when she saw one. And she also happened to be one of the great beauties of Hartford. She was stunning. So she had a lot of guys around her all the time. Meanwhile, being a great idealist, she was a settlement house nurse in the time when that was this was the progressive era in the United States, and she wanted to do something to help the underprivileged. So she became a settlement house nurse, and she was seeing really tough stuff all the time. She was seeing great suffering, great poverty, and she'd been doing that for a while. But then she met Charlie, and she was terrifically struck by Charlie, who was a friend of her brother, an old friend of her brother. They were kind of thunderstruck by each other. And here's the thing, I mean, it was a passionate thing, but it was also, they were both deep idealists. Harmony was much more conventionally religious than Charlie. Charlie always had this kind of universal religious thing going. As he put it in his essays later, something bigger, an art bigger than Christian, pagan, or Jew, or angel, a kind of all-encompassing sense of spirituality. She was more conventional, but they both had this tremendous idealism, and that informed their relationship from the beginning. And therefore, it informed his art. So, I'm going to be choking up when I'm talking about this because everybody does. Jim Sinclair, when I was working on my book, called me one day and said, you've got to come down here. I found the most amazing thing. It was something that John Kirkpatrick had kept for many years, perhaps because he promised Harmony he would never show them to anybody. It was her love letters to Charlie. They formed a kind of theology around his music. And the idea was that love, human love, is a parcel of divine love. Therefore, our love is a parcel of divine love. And your music will be our way together of spreading that love into the world. And that's when Ives's music took off. Specifically, if there's a single event on their honeymoon, or I think it may have been a little later, they went to Stockbridge, and they were walking along the river, the Housatonic, such an Ivesian moment. in the kind of glory of new love. And it was autumn, and so there were leaves floating down the river. And in the distance, they heard a hymn coming from the church. And they got home, and Harmony saw Ives writing something. And what he was doing was trying to get that scene into music. What became the Housatonic at Stockbridge, third of the three places in New England. And so with that piece, in effect, he reached his maturity. But the thing is that it's not only based on a visual experience and an experience, it builds up into this towering kind of everything all at once climax, which is a vision of divine love. And then there's a very Ivesian ending. It builds up into this huge sound and then cuts off, and you hear this distant, unresolved chord fading into the distance, because that's part of what Ives believed, that a piece of music is just a part of a larger kind of eternal music. And he literally reproduced that effect a lot in his music that just sort of drift off as if it's continuing somewhere else. And that, the Housatonic at Stockbridge, and that vision of divine love, is really where his maturity began. And it's there that he began to put together his experiments into longer pieces. Now I'm sort of I'll get away from the spiritual and idealistic again, back to the practical. Now he had, through all these experiments he had done, he had the techniques to handle pitches and musical materials in a totally new way that anticipate, of course, things that came later, ideas like tone clusters and polytonality and polyrhythm and all these things that came from observed life, but also came from a sense of understanding of musical technique and experimenting with technical ideas. Now he knew how to put them into larger pieces for the first time. But one of the things he had to do in order to really realize himself as a composer of longer pieces is to get rid of traditional forms. As he put it, the old Germanic recipe, the hell with it. So he began to write new kinds of long pieces, single movement pieces that kind of unfold as what I call sometimes the Ivesian wedge. They begin small and then gradually expand. He began to develop new kinds of form, and that were not traditional, based on traditional forms or genres. He was not calling pieces sonata for a while or symphony anymore. He invented the idea of a set, which was unique to him. It was an assemblage of often independently written pieces that were arranged according to some programmatic thematic idea and were, contrast and so forth and so on. And he worked with these for a while and began to write some of his early mature pieces, but gradually he began to work back to pieces called sonata and symphony, starting with the Concord Sonata, because now he did not feel intimidated by the old Germanic recipe anymore. Now he knew what he was doing. He had his materials firmly in hand, so he could write the Concord Sonata, which is very much in the Beethovenian tradition. It's a heroic first movement, which he called Emerson, a scherzo, which he called Hawthorne, a slow movement, which was Alcott's, and a fourth movement, Thoreau. This is on the model of a traditional four-movement Germanic symphony, though without a fast, slow final movement. That's the only difference. But now he's thinking of the transcendental philosophers in Concord, who were part of the Concord Sonata, and his own inspirations and his own voice. He had his voice firmly in hand, but his voice was all-encompassing. He still was the child of a band director who did arrangements of Beethoven symphonies and popular tunes and everything all at once. His idea of style was not constrained anymore. So the first movement, and meanwhile, each of the movements of the Concord Sonata were based firmly on his conception of that person. Emerson is craggy, and he has a vision of Emerson on a mountaintop. It's searching. The musical material never sits still. It never doubles back. It never repeats anything. It's a constant search, which was his conception of Emerson. Hawthorne was based on the kind of imaginative fantasy stories of Hawthorne, but it's also a scherzo. It was also based on Hawthorne's comic story, The Celestial Railroad. Third movement, the Alcotts, he imagined the Alcotts playing in the parlor in Concord, and it has bits and pieces of Beethoven's Fifth, which is one of the themes in the whole of the Concord. He's integrating what he wants to do is to integrate the European tradition with an American voice, and American ideals, and American melodies. That is what is essential, you could say one of his essential projects as a composer, as a creator, to unify the America with the great European tradition of music, and therefore to create a genuinely American music that is not separate from Europe, but it is something purely American and also regional. He said the way to be American is to be local. The way to the universal is through the local. And so he was, by the way, he did not believe in nationalism. He rejected nationalism. He called it medieval. But he said, you've got to be who you are. You write out of who you are. I came out of Connecticut, so that's what I write out of. And I'm an American, I write out of that. So he made his way back to the European tradition in a direct way. And then he wrote the Third and Fourth Symphonies. And I'm not going to be able to get, in a way, all the way through those, but meanwhile, he had early in his New York years some 2 church jobs, one of them a big deal of a big church, but he wrote a very proper kind of Horatio Parker style cantata called The Celestial Country for that job, and then just kind of quit in disgust. He was basically saying, if I have to write this kind of stuff to be a church musician, and I'm not going to be able to follow my own most ambitious ideas, I'm just going to quit, as he put it, quit music. So he did. And he had tremendous isolation, but one of the myths is he never had anything to do with professional musicians. Not true. He would often show his stuff to professionals who almost invariably told him he was crazy. And this did affect him. It affected him a lot. He would be thrown off often by these things for a while. And he would hire theater bands who could read like crazy. At the end of a night, there'd be this crazy guy giving him money on the spot to read through his weird pieces. A lot of theater musicians in New York knew about Charles Ives. He at one point was playing recitals during the war with a concertmaster of a major New York orchestra. He was a superior pianist. So he wrote in isolation, though he didn't want to be isolated. He wanted his music to communicate with people, but there was no context. What began to happen in the 20s, he had a major heart attack, which was the result of diabetes around the beginning of the war. It began to affect his vision, his hearing. His hearing was distorted. And in the 20s, he began to wind down. Finally, at some point, he came downstairs and said to his wife, I can't compose anymore. Nothing goes right. He is somebody who had to write it to find his notes at the piano. If your hearing is distorted, you can't do that so much. And his energy was affected. He probably had a series of strokes. So he began to, meanwhile, have champions, mainly Henry Cowell. And he became associated with the modernists of the time, American modernists. They called themselves ultramodernists, and their focus, their inspiration was European. But they embraced Ives because they understood, A, that he was very important, and they understood that he was a way of getting toward an American music, which is something they wanted to do too, even though they were rather European-oriented. He also had a lot of money, and he began to support new music and composers everywhere. Ives gave a lot more money to other composers than he did to his own music. So he had champions. Meanwhile, European modernism in the 20s was beginning to come into the States, and people were starting to hear the kind of sounds that he wrote from official European progressive modernist composers, so they all began to associate Ives with that milieu, which was not where he came from. But that was the only milieu that would embrace him. The American people who called themselves composers and artists who called themselves ultra-modernists, they were his champions. They were his friends. So he went with them. And Ives, meanwhile, was supporting new music activities all over the place. He had dinners at his house with people like Mio, and I think Bartók came to dinner during a tour. He was very much involved in new music activities. And he had to go along with these people who saw his music sort of in their own ultramodernist terms, and therefore innovation was the coin of the realm. He had to go along with that. So we started saying, well, here are my innovations. Well, that was not really what they came from. They came from his father and from his own experiments and from his inspiration from his wife. That's where it came from. It didn't come. But meanwhile, they could only associate him with Stravinsky and Schoenberg and critics and so forth because that's all they knew. They couldn't say, here is a completely unique composer who was a one-man tradition who happens to have anticipated the developments of contemporary music for years in the future. That took a long time to understand. So all kinds of myths began to grow up, and he was a cult. He was a cult figure for a long time. And he was taken up by people like Bernard Herrmann, who became a great film music composer. He was a conductor. There was sort of a cult around Ives. And there was young Elliott Carter, who sort of became like a bit of a son to Ives. And Carter, I think, was both working against Ives's father and for him for the rest of Carter's life, sometimes putting him down and sometimes doing some important stuff to spread the word. And things began to happen. He won the Pulitzer Prize, but more importantly, John Kirkpatrick played the Concord Sonata in 1939, and one of the leading critics in the country said this is the greatest music composed by an American. But since Ives by this point was an invalid, frequently bedridden, unable to create new music, but tinkering with his old music and writing in things into his copied scores in ways that would create headaches for editors for time immemorial. But, you know, he was playing with music that at the time nobody was much interested in, so why not? He was creative, he had to do something. So he would tinker with his music and he would jot down ideas, and he spent years doing a new addition to the Concord Sonata, sometimes putting in more radical ideas that had been earlier that he had tamed down for the first publication around 1920. And he did what he could, and he did recordings to give people privately as examples of how to do his music. And the word began to spread very slowly, and Leonard Bernstein took him up, even though Bernstein was back and forth and called him a Grandma Moses, but nonetheless did an important premiere of the Second Symphony, 50 years after it was written. And the word began to spread, and I think the real explosion after Ives died was the premiere of the Fourth Symphony by Stokowski, which was called a great masterpiece on its premiere, and that's when it really began to happen, I think. And it took a while because to absorb somebody who is singular takes a while. It's the same thing that happened to Melville and Moby Dick, really. When it came out, it was just incomprehensible. And the people who championed Ives were not mainstream figures, really. They were kind of the insular world of ultramodernism. And to get out into the public, and I remember in the 60s or 70s, I remember Gunther Schuller playing the Robert Browning Overture with the New England Conservatory Orchestra in the 70s, and people just laughed at it. They said, oh, this is silly stuff. I think Ives needs to be explained in a way that maybe Mozart and Brahms and Beethoven don't. You really need to know, I think, some of his ideals. Not for all his music. The Second Symphony is something anybody can understand. So he wrote I think some of his greatest songs are just simple little parlor songs that are traditional. because he could do anything. He had the widest harmonic vocabulary of any composer who ever lived. But to extend his music, with people hear for the first time, they're hearing, hymns and popular songs and marches and total pandemonic chaos, and it's confusing. I have found that when you explain what Ives's ideals were and why he put music together the way he did, people kind of get it. So I think the future of Ives has a lot to do with better performances that come from the new editions that Jim Sinclair and others are doing, which makes musicians more enthusiastic about playing from parts they can read well, and therefore playing them better. The reason my Ives biography happened is I heard Michael Tilson Thomas's and playing the Holidays Symphony on radio by chance, a live performance from Chicago, and I said, my God, they're playing it like Mozart. This is really maturing, and the audience got it. They got it. So all these things work together to explain Ives and spread a unique character who had a vision of the possibilities of music and how they relate to the possibilities of human spirituality. And what he believed was the growth of humanity toward the divine.